What I want to share tonight is personally very difficult. This issue will be very controversial. This is very, very bad news. And the only reason I'm doing this is that there have been information coming in pinging my system, indicating that we're getting closer to the hoaxing of events to stampede the world into something that would make 9/11 look like a picnic. There are a number of signs that have been mounting on this issue over the last 6 to 9 months, and I'm gravely concerned about it. So what I'm going to be discussing is what in the parlance of the Pentagon, CIA counterintelligence programs is known as a false INW, or a deceptive INW, or indication and warning. And some years ago I had a meeting with the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency and General Patrick Hughes, and the focus of that briefing, which was quite extensive, was to give him information so that he would not be deceived in the event of a false or deceptive INW, indication and warning, dealing with the UFO and ET issue. As it turned out, the general had no knowledge of either the UFO issue, the extraterrestrial issue, or the fact that there was already afoot, planned since the 1950s, a program to hoax a threat from outer space. This was something that the general was very concerned about, because prior to the meeting I had sent a briefing through courier to the general. He's a 3-star. And he was unaware of any of these issues. And he sort of mirrored what he said, almost word for word, what the first director of the CIA that I briefed in 1993 said, and that is, I have made inquiries into this issue, but I have been provided no information. And at that point he goes over to a bookshelf in the meeting room for the general, which is in the E ring of the Pentagon, picks up a doll, a little ET doll, looks like one of those little things you get at a toy store, and he held it up, and he was, with great anger, said, "This is all I have gotten for my inquiries on the UFO issue." And it was, of course, people making fun of him. And I said, yes, that's typical. However, there are people on your senior staff who are permanently assigned to this directorate, to being the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, whereas the director rotates, just like the CIA director rotates. And they know about it, but they're not telling you because they want to keep you in the dark. Now that little vignette multiplied all throughout the dysfunction of governments around the world. And so you have people who often, you would think, who would have knowledge of these issues. And it turns out they do not. And then there are other people who should have nothing to do with something this sensitive, who are running the projects outside constitutional oversight of the President, the Congress, and their appointees, and of we, the people, most importantly. This is why Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, the first CIA director when it was formed in 1947, took the place of the OSS, said in a letter that the secrecy surrounding UFOs was a threat to the national security. This is why Eisenhower said the secrecy, unwarranted secrecy is what he said. It could be a threat to our democracy and our way of life.
Of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
But the problem is, in that vacuum of secrecy, extreme, illegal, unacknowledged special access projects, which is what they're called, that you have a permanent infrastructure that has evolved or spun off from the legitimate government, but that is embedded within the corporate sector, the intelligence community, and the military sector, that has run amok viciously of our liberties and our freedoms, and have therefore been given no oversight or restraints so that they could set up a dynamic where they could hoax an alien attack on planet Earth. There's no point in despairing, because what I have seen, and this is the part of me that's sort of the spirit warrior in my lucid dreams of the future, is a future where these issues have resolved. We have a peaceful civilization here. There's free energy running the planet. There's anti-gravity systems, so we move above the surface and don't need surface roads. Poverty is ended. There is complete economic and social justice in the world, and a sustainable, clean planet that becomes a level 1, as Michikaku would say, planet that can go forward and go into space peacefully.
So you've talked about different types of type 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 even of the Kardashev scale of the different kind of civilizations. What do you think it takes, if it is indeed a ridiculous notion that we're alone in the universe, what do you think it takes to reach out?
I'm a physicist. We rank things by 2 parameters, energy and information. That's how we rank black holes. That's how we rank stars. That's how we rank civilizations in outer space. So a type 1 civilization is capable of harnessing planetary power. They control the weather, for example. Earthquakes, volcanoes, they can modify the course of geological events, sort of like Flash Gordon or Buck Rogers. Type 2 would be stellar. They play with stars, entire stars. They use the entire energy output of a star, sort of like Star Trek. The Federation of Planets have colonized the nearby stars. So a type 2 would be somewhat similar to Star Trek. Type 3 would be galactic. They roam the galactic space lanes. And type 3 would be like Star Wars, a galactic civilization.
But the cosmic false flag that I want to talk about is the crown jewel of the secrecy that was hatched in the 50s that led to Eisenhower losing control of these programs. And no president since that time has had full operational access control. They've had knowledge, but not control over these rogue elements. So now we're 60 years into a period where these operations have run amok, so much so that it has become an existential threat to life on Earth. And this is something we have to understand what the modus operandi is. What are the means for achieving this goal? When do you think they might do this? It's already happened. It's already happened. The false flag has already happened. Now, not the crescendo moment, not the final act, all right? But acts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, whatever, have already transpired. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, these operations figured out that the psychological warfare value of this subject was such that they could set up events that are completely hoaxed, beginning in the 50s and 60s, that would convince people that those events were of extraterrestrial origin, alien, when they were not. And so blur the lines between the actual ET activity and the human stagecraft, as it's called, that most people, including people at the White House, wouldn't know the difference. And I began speaking of this in the 90s, and I would often say, is it real or is it Memorex? You know, the old commercial for Memorex tapes when there used to be tapes and not digital. And the problem is, who is doing a test, an assay, to see whether it's fool's gold or real gold? Certainly not UFO subculture, and certainly not the media. No one in government I know, for the most part, has a clue. Even mid-level people, functionaries, within the majority intelligence committee, MAGIC, M-A-J-I-C, that runs these operations, do not know about this. These false flag operations, and I do like the term deceptive indication and warning, very military, very precise. By the way, you mentioned that to anyone who's in counterintelligence and military intelligence, they're going to know what it means. Why? Because this is nothing new. Do you think this is the first time this has happened? All right, so there was something called the Vietnam War, and during that period, Kennedy wanted to pull us out, was assassinated. Johnson was reluctant to expand, and so they hoaxed an event, or exaggerated an event, called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And the Gulf of Tonkin, basically what we did, we hoaxed and exaggerated the attack on our ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, there near Vietnam, so that it would cause outrage in the public, outrage in Congress, and it stampeded President Johnson into vastly expanding our presence in Vietnam, which of course enriched, guess who? The military-industrial complex. You ever heard of something called 9/11?
The only evidence that fits is a holographic plane. And if you go to YouTube and search nosed out 9/11, you'll see this footage. And you see the plane penetrate the building and then the cockpit come out the other end with no resistance whatsoever, which is a total fraud right there just by itself. But then you see the cockpit emerge unscathed pretty much. That would mean that the cockpit would have been on the street because it was ejected. Of course, we know that didn't happen. They didn't recover a single plane part. But it goes even further than that. There's some really great footage showing the holographic wing on one of the planes disappearing. And that's case closed as well. And it's very simple to fool people. Holograms are so lifelike. They actually can have sound with them as well. They can be projected with planes or satellites. So this technology does exist. It's the only thing that would enable people on the ground to think that they saw the plane hit. But this plane is so phony. The lighting's off. It's all gray. It's not a real plane at all. And you can see it just melts into the building, okay? This is another shot kind of from the side. And look, you can see the wing disappear right there on this side. The wing gone. No reason that happens unless it's a hologram. Wasn't a real plane. Real planes would have had wings and tail section sheared off and fall to the ground. There was absolutely none of those plane parts been sheared off. I mean, that steel was stronger than if they hit, you know, a tank, literally a World War II tank. It just boom, it would have sheared everything off. And it looks pretty good when it's in real time. It actually was pretty well done. But when you slow it down, you see that left wing disappear. And it gets even more obvious the slower it is. I'm going to go ahead and let this finish. Here's it's a good shot here. course, you can see no markings. Most of those planes are silver, by the way, usually, and they're very reflective. You see none of that. It's like they made it the same color as that gray on the building on purpose, I think.
I have a gentleman who was the third highest ranking man at the Naval Research Labs, who prior to 9/11, in the Vice President's office, saw the plans for 9/11 prior to it occurring. And he was told, look, I was told my wife and my children, my grandchildren would be killed along with me if I ever mentioned this. He took it to his grave, gave me the information. God bless him, Rick Foch, who was a very high-ranking scientist, an aerospace figure in the Naval Research Labs, which is the biggest Department of Defense lab. So when 9/11 happened, which was about 4 or 5 months after the 2001 disclosure event, where we had hundreds of thousands of people contacting Congress to hold hearings on this issue, which of course when 9/11 happened, that fell way to the back burner very quickly. And they then said, well, we got to go get those guys in Afghanistan. Then they did something else, another false flag. They concocted false intelligence, yellow cake, remember the story yellow cake, uranium out of Africa. They made up all these stories. And they put poor Colin Powell up before the UN holding a vial of anthrax and other biological and chemical weapons, saying that Saddam Hussein in Iraq had these. He did not. And he was put up there thinking that he was being provided accurate intelligence when he was not. And there are people on the inside who have come forward saying that they knew that that intelligence was wrong or very likely wrong. But based on that, we went into Iraq, where we are still embroiled, blew up that whole area of the world. Now we have ISIS. And this was all planned and known with malice aforethought. So we don't have to reach back thousands of years to see the extent to which these false flag operations, hoaxed events, exaggerated threats can stampede a populace and the Congress and the presidency into very dangerous and bad decisions. Now, the mother lode of that kind of event is what has been planned assiduously since the 1950s, and that is a threat from outer space that is alien, that would put all of humanity together, but against one or more extraterrestrial races. Now that plan, which they came up with in the 1950s, has been very carefully rolled out. And I want to put this into 3 categories. You have assets that are material, stagecraft. And let's call these advanced aircraft of man-made origin, all right? Things like this. Man-made, anti-gravity, going all the way back to the late 50s and 60s. Triangular, disc, boomerang, etc. Now, what you need to understand is that around October 1954, we attained gravity control. So gravity control meaning electromagnetic systems that affect an object so it becomes seemingly weightless, levitates, and corrects for gravity. Okay, so without boring people with a physics lesson, if you make something close to massless, then you can accelerate it at enormous speeds with very little power. And it can go right-hand turns, go up and down, and if you can control for the interior at 1G, in other words, 1 gravitational field, then you can go at 100,000 miles per hour, make a right-hand turn, and your brains don't come out of your ears. The secret weapon that we had was the atomic bomb. The secret weapon Adolf Hitler was working on was this. Okay, and the so-called Nazi bell, and they never got it stable enough to do a lot with it. So Werner von Braun, Hermann Oberth, and others who'd worked at Pinatubo and these other facilities for the Germans in World War II were brought into, instead of being executed, like many Nazis were, they were brought into our intelligence community, into our aerospace community. And some of them, unfortunately, took it over from inside. So the globe today is a Fourth Reichian fascist order. And there are all kinds of actors and players that have glommed on to that agenda. A bizarre collection of people from different walks of life and different agendas. But the secrecy around this issue has only been partial. They have been wanting a certain acculturation around UFOs and ETs for the purpose of having the public think that it could be true. They don't really know what it is. So right now, more than half the public, over this longitudinal, long-term psychological propaganda warfare program launched in the 50s, believe UFOs are real. They believe there's intelligent life in the universe. But that's about where the granular knowledge ends. There's not a lot of granular knowledge, detailed knowledge of what all this is. So in October 1954, gravity control was mastered, and we began to build various prototypes of what the public would call UFOs. And some were made to simulate the shape, appearance, and motion of an extraterrestrial vehicle. Because what better way to confuse people than to have something that looks almost the same? Is it gold? Is it fool's gold? Is it real? Is it Memorex? Get where I'm going here? This is how the spy masters operate. Now that's one category. We'll return to this. There's another category, and this is more difficult to understand, and that is electromagnetic assets. And these include electromagnetic systems that could optically, like a very advanced hologram, simulate an event. Electromagnetic systems that have been called popularly electronic warfare systems that are psychotronic and radionic, that interface with consciousness and thought. And electromagnetic systems that can affect large segments of the population when targeted. And then the other asset, the third category, is human intelligence, human assets. And these are folks who, some wittingly, some unwittingly, have been provided with a script and experiences that they honestly believe are real, but that have been programmed and are like very advanced consciousness holographic experiences, if you will, electronic hallucinations. Now, so those three categories in general are what we're going to focus on. First, let's talk about the material assets that are being made by Lockheed Martin Skunk Works, Northrop Grumman, my uncle's old company, Boeing, Phantom Works, etc. Now, some of the material that was being done by the Nazis with the so-called Nazi Bell began to get more and more perfected, and the research between the mid-40s and the mid-50s was augmented, assisted, or propelled forward by the reverse engineering and study in a separate compartment of so-called extraterrestrial materiel. I'm referring now to things that some of you have heard about, like certainly the Roswell crash, and these objects, which were downed with electronic warfare systems. They didn't just fly in and crash in an electrical storm. That's a myth. You don't go through interstellar space and come into the atmosphere of Earth and oops, I can't navigate, and then just suddenly crash. And it happens to be right by the only atomic bomb squadron in the world in Roswell, New Mexico. That was the only 509th Bomber Squadron was the only place in the world at the time of that event. And the interstellar civilizations were worried about what is going on Earth, because when we detonated those bombs, it was picked up by them. And they came. And they're here. And they're worried. And they should be worried. So that's what opened up the modern era of UFO extraterrestrial activity. If you use that pop culture term of UFO, there are two types. Man-made ones here, interstellar extraterrestrial ones here. And you can tell the difference if you get up close enough, and if you know what you're looking for. And we'll talk about that. The ones that were being developed by these early aerospace and research efforts were then benefited by studying the extraterrestrial objects, that we began to learn how to use electromagnetic scalar longitudinal systems. Now, I'm not going to get into a big physics discussion here except to say the light you're seeing here is in a wave like this, right? So you have a wavelength, and so you have all kinds of spectra. Infrared, ultraviolet, visible spectra, different. A laser is coherent light. So a green laser is all the green, and it's coherently propagating, okay? Longitudinal or scalar electromagnetic signal is actually not a wave, but a point in a line. And it actually can propagate at multiples of the speed of light, of the waveform of light. So the waveform of light is what we call the speed of light, but there's this other type. So that began to be studied also in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, began to be weaponized into systems, and by 1947 or so, they began to have successful deployments of it so that it would hit an interstellar vehicle, interfere with its electronics, and have it crash. So when you begin to hear that beginning from the 40s until not that long ago, there were multiple crash retrievals of these objects. And by the 1960s, they had successfully propagated those around the globe in enough locations covertly that they could track and target an extraterrestrial vehicle, hit it, and have it to become disabled. Now, when you begin to consider then, we've had over 60 years, 62 years, and trillions of dollars in black budget unacknowledged special access funding, USAP, unacknowledged special access, completely black, funding of this kind of research and development, both on extraterrestrial material and on other conventional. You can begin to realize that what's out there that humans control is fearsome and awesome. And unfortunately, to the lay person or to the average general, admiral, or president, is indistinguishable from an extraterrestrial object in their mind. So that is really the danger point. That is where you have the risk of you being able to take these objects that are 100% man-made and, for example, this boomerang flying object seen through around the Hudson Valley, I believe this one. And people got right up underneath it. Look what's underneath. Can you see that? Little tubes and structures and grids and what have you. That's not extraterrestrial. That's man-made. And they were just seeing what the public would do. So people were stopped on the freeway reporting it. Tens of thousands of people saw these. Silent. A little bit of a humming sound, like a transformer. 100% man-made. 100% fooled everyone looking at it. Thought it was E.T. This is what I'm saying. False flags already happened. Another one that was reported are the big flying triangles, 200-300 feet across. Remember these? Belgium, other places. Look underneath. So these have been reported, and they have a grid structure, very manufactured, very man-made. Now, here's another layer of confusion. There are extraterrestrial objects that look like and approximate the man-made ones. There's a plethora of these that are very strange looking, and these are all man-made. Now, to anyone who would casually see this, and then objects that were very similar to what was seen in the Phoenix Lights, these sort of objects. Now, one of the people who you all have heard of, I'm sure, who was the Lockheed Skunk Works head for years until he passed away, is Ben Rich. And, you know, I have people who were at meetings with him where he confirmed that we had things that could, quote, take ET home. So what you need to understand is that the intelligence community is thrilled if the UFO community says it was a UFO, it was all alien, when in reality it's not that simple. It's both. Some of it's ET, some of it's man-made. So this understanding is key. Otherwise, everyone's going to assume anything that we don't understand that zips around is extraterrestrial. Moreover, anything that would come over and do an Independence Day attack, boom, is extraterrestrial, when it isn't. It is not. It is absolutely not. It's all a lie. It's the biggest hoax in human history, and you've got to wake up to this. Now, here's another object that's been seen. Very unusual, very detailed, excellent rendition that Mr. Shred has done. Man-made, very advanced. I suspect would deceive almost everyone who saw it. And this is the Hudson Valley boomerang shape, probably out of the Boeing Phantom Works. And tens of thousands of people saw this, by the way. The ones who were close enough to it could see actually the structure and the girds and the struts and the infrastructure of the craft. Well, interstellar vehicles don't have that. So here's a little tip. The ET objects are seamless, have no parts like that, and have a completely different quality to them because they are interstellar and transdimensional. Because they go beyond the speed of light and they are manufactured in a way that is completely different. So I don't want to lose everyone with a lot of jargon here, but if you can for a moment, you've heard of 3D printing? Imagine if you did 3D printing, but from another dimension. Think about that for just a minute. So that you, if you had mastered 0-point energy, the base energy field that all matter and energy is fluxing from, all subatomic particles, and you had mastered it in such a way that you could create a resonant frequency in the shape of a spacecraft. And it would then go from that fourth, fifth dimensional energy field into 3D as almost an extrusion mold. Does this make sense? And we would materialize in that perfect form. In the last 21 years, trillions of dollars have been spent on this, and some of the most brilliant minds in the world have worked on it. Some of these gentlemen I know, scientists, and they've worked in the Cube, as it's called, up there at the Skunk Works underground, not far from Palmdale. And in the Cube, they've done things that are now transdimensional. Very dangerous business. Now, this is why the president-elect and the Congress and the National Military Command Center and the director of the CIA and the Secretary of Defense and the generals on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, most of whom will never be read into what I'm sharing, need to know this. They have a need to know. And so do you, the public, so you're not fooled. Because there is a group that has malice aforethought and has planned to launch these assets in a way that would look like 100% like an attack on our planet or on human assets, calling it alien when it's being run by people. I call it the Wizard of Oz. So you have these guys, you know, it's like the Wizard of Oz, remember at the end, they pull the curtain back and there's this old crudmudgeon pulling all the levers, scaring the hell out of Dorothy. And now we have an Air Force Office of Special Investigations counterintelligence officer confirming the false flag operations. But he would not discuss, he says, that's still very secret, that's very secret, I can't talk about that. We have it on camera, jumping out of his skin, because I asked the question in a way that he understood. Do you know about the deceptive INWs and the false INWs? No one else running the cameras knew what that term meant. He did.
Have you been exposed, or did you come across in your career and your network the false INW or the deceptive indication and warnings projects related to this?
Yes.
And what did you find out about those?
That's pretty hush. I don't think I should talk about that. Yeah.
I mean, that's when I briefed the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, that was the main subject.
That is, that's very sensitive. Yeah.
So there have been abduction squads, which are also confirmed by this Air Force intelligence officer, that have been operative for decades. And when it has suited the intelligence community, they have engaged in human abductions that 100% fool those poor victims who really think they were abducted by an ET. The aircraft itself, which is an anti-grav, the stagecraft initially were special operations personnel who now they have robotic ones that look actually like certain species of ETs. The extraterrestrial biological entities in the EBINs. But they're man-made. I know several people who worked on making these creatures, and they've been called programmed life forms, but they have integrated circuits in their neural complex. They're 100% man-made. Those are fully operational, have been for decades. It's also done in association with electromagnetic weapon systems that alter awareness, can make you black out, and also certain chemicals, drugs, canisters that'll be thrown, and the person will then pass out, have no memory of what happened, and then awaken with this other event happen, having been abducted by an extraterrestrial. In November of 1989, Paris de Cuellar was abducted out of his motorcade at about 3 a.m. in New York City by aliens. And he was taken and on board this human-controlled abduction event and told that if he were to continue with that plan, that the aliens would abduct everyone involved, including the President of the United States. Now, because of that, Gorbachev, Bush Sr., the President, Paris de Cuellar, and others involved canceled the plans to let the public know we weren't alone, because they were concerned that, and I was told, and I'm quoting, by Prince Harry von Liechtenstein, that this blew up like an atomic bomb in the Bush White House, and they said, we're staying out of this now. And ever since then, no one in that office has wanted to deal with this, because they don't know what's ET and now what's human. Now I want to talk about another level of this, and this is a more complex one than what I've shared. And that is the electromagnetic systems, human-controlled, that affect consciousness and the human experience. Some people call these radionic and psychotronic systems that can affect consciousness. They can also affect biological systems. They can induce cancers. They can induce heart attacks. They can do a lot of nasty stuff with these weapons, and they have.
And this is why all of the microwave transmitters are going up everywhere. Because somebody, if they wanted to, could use them for other effects. The system is up and running.
MIT was awarded a number of years ago to Woody Norris. This is 2005 or 2006. And that award was $500,000 for doing what's called acoustic heterodyning, being able to send a signal from 2 points into an individual so they literally hear a voice in their head that nobody around them hears.
I mean, voices are the easiest ones, because all you have to do is stimulate the cochlea with a set resonant frequency. It's very easy. Voices are very easy, and it isn't people imagining voices, they physically hear them. You can physically make people hear voices, certain voices, and it can be any conversation, and it can be anybody you want to hear. It can be a soft, angelic voice, it can be a god, it can be something that scares you like a devil. It could be anything.
DARPA let a couple of contracts back in 2011, 2012 to the University of California for what's called electronic telepathy, being able to monitor the brain activity of human beings at a distance and determine what they're thinking. And then on a second contract, actually developing complex signals, being able to send them into the brain of another person, literally transmit a message. This is where the technology is today.
What we're here to talk about today is the fact that the brain is and will be the 21st century battlescape in many ways. End of story. You will encounter some form of neurocognitive science that has been weaponized not only in your military career, but in your personal and professional lives. It is valid, valuable, and already in operational play. The brain is the current and future battle space. What's new about this is the in-close nature of this. Increasingly, we're not seeing these things as weapons of mass destruction against gross aspects of the population. More specifically, perhaps, might be targeting individuals on a level that allows either direct attribution or covert engagement with non-attribution. Formal definition of a weapon, probably the one that you've heard about most recently, most contemporaneously in the literature, is the possibility to use some form of directed energy to affect physiology peripherally and also to affect the physiology and health of the brain. Case in point here, U.S. Embassy personnel in Havana and possibly in China. Clearly, one of the things we can also do is transcranial neuromodulation, the idea of going through the skull to modulate the node and network activity of the brain, to implant certain brain-machine interfaces. These are many of the DARPA programs that you may hear of now. Probably the one that is most notorious is something called the N3 program, which is the non-invasive neurosurgical neuromodulation program being run by their program manager, Dr. Al Mundi. The idea here is to put minimal-sized electrodes in a network within a brain through only minimal intervention to be able to read and write into the brain function in real time, remotely. And by affecting the way that brain is built and the way it functions, influence in ways that are kinetic and non-kinetic. The attitudes, beliefs, thoughts, emotions, activities. Look at the power that understanding tools and techniques of the brain sciences afford.
If you want to cause a specific psychiatric illness, you would have an infrared device that followed the person, and you would link it to a pencil-thin microwave source, so the microwave beam would always target a specific gland or a specific part of the brain or an eye or a heart. If they want to experiment on you, by the thousands they will. And you can be driven to insanity and death, and you just become a tick in a box without any so much as a feeling. Yeah, and this is what they do, and this is why they are above the law. One of the experiments was to take an ordinary sane person, cause insanity, and have a psychiatrist who was unknown to everybody diagnose schizophrenia or paranoia or a psychiatric illness. That was a successful outcome, and the person would spend the rest of their life in an asylum in misery, but to the government scientists that was a success.
We also see the use of biodata as a viable weapon. Manipulating biodata so that I can then put into your particular medical records subtle information that may change the disposition of whether you're sick or not, change how you're treated, influence the postures that go to you in terms of insurance, care, viability for military service. By altering that information, by changing those data, by purloining those data, I essentially change the you of you. And I can do that in very subtle and insidious ways. Furthermore, I can do that on a variety of different levels that can affect key individuals, so that in fact your medical record changes to thereby render you incapable or at least invalid to be able to serve in a way you're serving. Or I can do that on a much larger scale, groups, populations. And if I change those data, I change the way you're being regarded and treated. And I can do that in one of two ways. I can do it in such a way that you're going to be regarded in a negative sense, or I can do that in such a way that I'm going to treat you incorrectly. If I say, for example, you have a particular allergy or you have a particular disorder, you will be treated for that, and that could then harm your health and your stability in both a short wars approach as well as a long wars approach.
Low-level microwaves were causing an enormous amount of cancers and leukemias and ill effects. And by then, everybody was leaping onto the microwaves as stealth weapons, and they go from there, which was the 50s, right up to and including the present day.
I guess my my frustration is why I couldn't get through to government, members of government in the House, Senate, or in the judiciary, or in the administration, or in the Inspector General's office, or anywhere, to actually start to realize what they were doing is stand up and say something against it openly. That was kind of the very frustrating part, because you thought these people who took the same oath of office that I did would actually do that, and you also thought that they would value the principles in the Constitution and what they stood for in terms of human rights and human freedom. But they don't apparently care for that. I mean, it's more it becomes an issue of money, control, and power, and it's not a question of human rights anymore. Our government could not just have a general writ, like the FISA court ordered with the Verizon transfer of data on 110 million plus U.S. citizens without being named or given probable cause or anything else. That was a general writ written by our FISA court that should be called into court by themselves and individually explain why they did that and what was the reason for it and their justification to do it. They need their day in court instead of doing everything in secret. They never come out and tell anybody what they're really doing or what their real understanding or secret interpretation is. That's because they're too afraid. They're cowards. They're hiding behind a secret interpretation applied with a secret court in secret by a secret government.
Being one of those people, and I've been someone who has been targeted with these systems, I can tell you that if you know they exist, you won't be fooled by them. If you don't know they exist, you will. And this is also why Lieutenant Colonel Tom Bearden put out years ago this book called The Real Star Wars. And Tony Craddock, my friend, just released it. And it's about these electromagnetic, radionic, and psychotronic systems. And this was released in the 80s. It's a little monograph this big. And Lieutenant Colonel Bearden knew about this. But this information's been out for decades, but it's sort of hidden in plain sight. What I want to do is connect these dots to folks so that you understand that, yes, there are extraterrestrial civilizations. They're very concerned with what's happening on this planet. And yes, there are humans that have these assets that mimic and have reached, and I'm going to use this word carefully, parity. Near equivalence with what an appearance would be of an extraterrestrial vehicle, because they have become more and more and more refined over the decades, up to and including very powerful electromagnetic systems that are transdimensional, can materialize things, if you go to Dugway Proving Grounds near Salt Lake City, near Provo, there are things going on there that look 100% ET, but they're not extraterrestrial, they're alien. They're man-made. But it's incredibly well-defined, well-developed. Now, one of the things that I've wondered in my own mind is to what extent there have been people who are embedded in our society who have had these scripted experiences and are sharing information that they believe to be true, but that have been completely scripted. I want to talk about a gentleman who I knew quite well, who's passed away, named Dr. Fred Bell. So Dr. Bell, the name sound familiar? Bell, Alexander Graham Bell, descendant of Alexander Graham Bell. And he had been given over to the MK Ultra program at the agency at birth, literally at birth, to the intelligence community, to be programmed as sort of a genius in aerospace and technology, and to work inside the system as sort of a electronically, psychotronically controlled slave. Now that's how I would put it. And he had gotten, and actually had met Wernher von Braun also. And his specialty, what they had trained him to do, was to develop weapon systems that would target, hit, and knock down extraterrestrial vehicles when they came out of trans-dimensional space-time into 3D. Now what that means is that as they then come into near Earth or materialize in our solar system, at that point they're trackable in the Deep Space Network, out of NORAD and other facilities, and Alpha satellites. As they approach Earth, then they can be targeted with these electronic scalar systems and hit. And that's what's been going on for over 70 years. This is an existential threat to Earth. So the fact that this has been going on for 70 years or more since Roswell, and there has not been a serious pushback, an overt pushback by these interstellar civilizations is remarkable. I doubt we would have behaved similarly. You're dealing with civilizations that have been visiting us on Earth for, dare I say, millions of years. Ancient aliens, anyone? But yes, I mean, we've never been alone. And suddenly we're doing atomic weapons and the nuclear weapons and these scalar weapons and all this other stuff. And they have not pushed back yet. So, you know, if they were so horrific, we would have known about it about 1945. It'd have been all over, point, set, match, finished. Guess what? The intelligence community loves that you're confused. And they put things out to further confuse you. To wit, mutilations. Okay, there's a man, Denver, very eminent medical doctor, fellow physician, hematologist, oncologist named Dr. John Altshuler. His uncle was the great General Jimmy Doolittle of World War II, who was sent over to the European theater during World War II by FDR to look into Foo Fighters. It was originally the object seen in World War II that the Nazis thought was a secret U.S. Allied weapon. We thought was a secret Nazi weapon. General Doolittle went over there, investigated it, and they were these trans-dimensional objects, spheres, balls of energy that would go around our aircraft, go down the center aisle of the planes, right between the men, out the other side, and this and that. And he came back and reported to FDR, and this is during World War II, that, and I'm quoting, he said, "Sir, those are interplanetary vehicles." So that's how far back this goes, and how far back has been studied very seriously. And so Dr. John Altshuler had a knowledge of this, deep knowledge of this, from his uncle, who was this general. He then lived in Colorado where Snippy the horse. Y'all remember Snippy the horse? The first so-called cattle mutilation was a cattle that was a horse. And he was called out because he was a pathologist, hematologist, pathologist, and he was interested in this. So he went out, began to study this in great detail, concluded they were all being done by counterintelligence operations using extraordinary technologies that are all human, staging it to look alien for its fear factor and its psychological warfare value. When did he conclude that? Oh, long before An Alien Harvest was written by Linda Moulton. And this is known in UFO circles. Now the question becomes, and this is a very big problem, what would compel someone to continue to report out to the public things that are extraterrestrial when it was established by the only true medical doctor and scientist in the field decades ago that it was a hoaxed, staged, false flag, supportive, in other words, an event supporting the false flag directive from the 50s. But I think that what I want people to understand is we have to be very careful about our assessment of what's out there in the universe based on people who have been in these programs who are, and I know that there was an executive at Gaia TV who was furious that I used this word, but who have been victims of this. And I don't think it's wrong to say if you're a 6 or 7 year old child and you're taken into a military abduction program and have stuff done to you, you've been a victim. I know that there are other people. I know Dr. Bell was a victim. Now this is not to say that the person is a bad person or a wrong person. It's just to say that we have to look at what is being shared and understand that there could be information that is accurate, information that might have been scripted, information and experiences that have been had that have been programmable. So the holographic psychotronic systems that have been in existence since the 50s would allow for people, and have allowed for people, to have experiences that they 100% believe. Just as the man told me, people would believe that they were, if they had a conversation with their personal God, they pass a lie detector. They are sincere about what they're reporting. There is no, I'm not saying any deceit is in play. What I'm saying is that it would be very easy to deceive somebody who's a child or a young adult with these fearsome weapon systems and technologies that are in the hands of absolute psychopaths. I mean, true psychopaths in the covert programs. And I know who some of these folks are, and they will stop at nothing to see that people are convinced that there is a threat, as Ronald Reagan said at the United Nations, that we should unite against and fight, to unite the world around.
We often forget how much unites all the members of humanity. Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us?
And all I have to say is that if the future is that future, you might as well dig a hole and climb in it. So we better wake up and understand that the information that is out there has to get looked at from many perspectives. What's the origin of the experience? Was it deep, unacknowledged special access projects that hoaxed it? Is that person having an experience with an extraterrestrial, interstellar civilization, an entity from another dimension that's not extraterrestrial, which is also out there? A scripted program from the intelligence community using these very advanced technologies that have been in development for 70 or 80 years? What is it? And it's not, I'm not trying, you have to ask these questions. And you have to begin to understand that there is a capacity to use this sort of information in a way that would redound to whom? The military, industrial, gangbangster, global complex of fascists that are desperate to have World War III be interplanetary. Why do we view anything that is other than us as a threat? We have to have a spiritual awakening, in my opinion, where we realize that we can transcend all these isms. And I want to add another ism, alienism. Alienism, as I'm going to define it tonight, is the proclivity to view anything that is non-human, but an intelligent life form, as a potential threat. And the threat is directly proportional to how different they either appear or behave from us. We can no longer live as a species that views anything that we don't understand or is different from us as a priori immediately a threat and get into a fight with them. Whether it is another race, another gender, another sexual orientation, another ethnicity, or another species from another planet. Because that only ends in destruction. It is in our collective experience as humans, but we can also overcome it through the force of our intellect, through spiritual development, and through the realization that within the field of conscious intelligence, there's a singularity of mind, and that all life in the universe and all intelligent life is awake through that same spirit. Doesn't matter who they are, where they are. And if we view ourselves and these other civilizations with the understanding of what the conscious mind is as an omnipresent field that is non-local, that there is a singularity of consciousness in mind. As Erwin Schrödinger said, the total number of minds in the universe is one. This is the father of modern quantum physics. The solution is, well, not simplistic, simple. It is spiritual, and it's a spiritual development. Not necessarily religious. I mean, I sort of make a distinction. Sometimes there's an inverse relationship between religiosity and spirituality. But not to say that not all religious people are not spiritual, but I'm just saying that if you're a fanatic religiously, you tend to not be very spiritual. And it becomes divisive. I mean, how many wars are we fighting over religious differences, which when you boil it down is ridiculous. But if we're now having to deal with interstellar civilizations that are waiting for us to join the interstellar club and the interstellar society, which is what's been happening for many decades, we're going to have to find a solution to this thinking, this paradigm of division, of racism and alienism, that the intelligence community, the bad actors here, not the good guys, but the bad actors have been exploiting because they know there is a history of people hating and fearing and fighting anyone that is different from them, whether it's a different sexual orientation and bashing gay people, or a different race with slavery, or a different gender and the suppression of women, or a different religion, on and on and on. And they know that they can exploit that, and they have been exploiting it. And we have to stand up and wake up and say, no more. We won't be fooled again. It is time for us to say, we're going to start living differently. We're going to have a civilization that is peaceful, that has free zero-point energy, that is just, and that is living in complete peace with itself and with others. And we are not going to go into space with weapon systems. We are not going to go into space looking for another ism, alienism, another group to fight. And that if someone tries to stage an event, we're all going to call it out as the hoax that it is, and not go along with that, what I'm calling scripted Armageddon. Now, when you also consider Anyone see Michael Jackson a couple years ago after he died in that holographic dance? Cool, huh? That's a declassified technology. You want to guess what's in the classified system? You want to guess? 1,000 times better than that Michael Jackson on the stage. That looked 100% like him actually. So let's begin to expose the fraud. If there were civilizations out there that were a threat to Earth and humanity, I think we'd know it by now. And Martin Luther King had it right, and Christ had it right, and Gandhi had it right. This spiritual understanding of the essential oneness of life and the need for not just world peace, but universal peace, that we owe it to our children and to the generations coming behind us, after us. Because the way I understand this is that we're closing out one era in the human experience, several 100,000 years in development. We're opening another era that's about 500,000 years in length, a cycle, universal cycle. And that cycle, the hallmark of it is universal peace. It'll be a day not followed by night, is how it is said. That there'll be a period, we'll enter into peace on this planet and peace in space, but we will not slide back into the darkness of war. Even if everything that is being said that is of a terrifying nature of things going on out in space or with this ET group or another, the only survivable operative system is the CE5, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind system, where based on the principles of nonviolence and universal peace, we have a rapprochement with these civilizations, we establish communication with them, we develop a civilization on our planet. And I also then remind people that civilizations, if they had that clear intent and wanted to do something, it would be very easy to do. I mean, remember when we first detonated atomic weapons and this whole modern era of UFOs being seen all over the world, wherever there was an atomic weapons facility developing, both in the Soviet Union and America, Great Britain, France, everywhere. Well documented in Disclosure Project material. If they had wanted to just put a pause button on this civilization, they could have done it. They didn't. One of the other concerns I have is that with many of these people, you'll hear that the ones that look Nordic, shall we say, and the ones that kind of look like us, but are pretty, those are good ones. The ones that look some other way, those are bad ones. Isn't that interstellar racism? Ultimately, as I said earlier, I cannot prove a negative. I can't prove there are no civilizations out there that are worse than we are. However, if there are, I still say the solution is contact, communication, conflict resolution within the construct of universal consciousness and universal peace. And my question is always, who would benefit from that kind of information? Now, I'm not someone who says that if there are such, let's call them misguided and dangerous elements out in other star systems, that we would want to ignore them. But I just think that we would want to discuss them and characterize them and interact with them in a different way. And I know that the folks who have been in the military programs connected to Mr. Tompkins and others have an agenda. And I question that agenda has to do with the propagation of fear and the convincing of the public that there's an existential threat, as Ronald Reagan said at the UN, that would unite the world to fight. This is my biggest fear.
That same month, I was told that I was going to be meeting with the Draco Alliance. The Draco Alliance that the people I was going to meet with were a Draco White Royal and some of the insectoids that were there with the Draco White Royal. That's supposed to represent me, and this 14-foot tall monster was one of the top White Royals. What sticks out the most beyond how invasive this being was when it interfaced with you, was the smell. It was kind of a musky urine smell. It was horrible. And there were, I thought there were 6, but Gonzalez said there were 5 women that were there that were obviously slaves. And as we left, we were able to bring them with us as a part of, as a good faith towards the negotiation they were trying to get us to take to the SBA.
My biggest fear is that disclosing this information gets hijacked and spun into this War of the Worlds, Independence Day kind of scenario, and that I would have forsaken my medical career and spent 26 years of my life and had very close friends murdered to add fire to interplanetary war? No. That's not, I don't want that to be what I'm working on. I would rather stop everything I'm doing than to propel further disclosure if what it leads to is piggybacking onto disclosure, this fearsome new world order